Good morning. We are back with our Parenting with the Experts class, and today we're joined by Jon Podein, who will introduce himself in just a moment. But if this is the first week that you're watching, we are going through a series over several different facets of what it means to be a Christian parent. We have some that are very general and how to keep an eye on our children and different priorities that we need to have as we're raising them, and a few that get a little bit more specific with either situations we might find ourselves in or issues that are trending today in our society. And this one is one that I've really looked forward to, and John, a conversation I've really looked forward to having with you since we've been planning this. Getting into the concept of broken homes and blended families. As we look towards the world around us and to the church specifically, it's almost something we're afraid to accept is becoming more and more common, something that typically has a very negative stigma around it. And I think where the church sometimes is confused as to how to handle these situations, it leaves the parents even more confused, especially if they're in the middle of something like that. But before we dive into the topic itself, John, tell us a little bit about yourself. Who are you? What's your background? What are you currently doing in the church?
Well, Landon, it is good to be with you. I just, you called an expert. I was like, wow, I don't know if I've ever been called an expert for anything before, but yeah, my name is Jon Podein. I am currently the outreach and engagement minister for the Calhoun Church of Christ in Calhoun, Georgia. I've been in ministry. Oh, I don't know. I have to give away my age, Landon. A little over 20 years, maybe a little bit more than 20 years now, but mainly it's been a lot of time within the youth work. That's where I spent a lot of my time, especially with different conferences and youth rallies, and after my quote formal education. So just spent most of my time down here in Alabama and Georgia and Florida, and just getting to be a part of the church is awesome. And so you get to meet lots of different people like you and all you other guys up there and up in Columbus, and just excited to be here with you.
Oh, yeah. I know John from a couple different avenues. He's one of the song leaders at CYC most years. And I think that's where a lot of people might recognize the name from. Also very involved with Lads to Leaders, and we worked together in that capacity a few times now. But as far as our topic today, jumping into broken homes and blended families, just on an introductory level to however much you're comfortable with talking about, what personal experience do you have with all of this?
Well, and this is an interesting topic. I think it's a great topic, actually, Landon, because I do think it is something that we do got to talk about in the church. And just from a way of experience, I've experienced that. I have, first of all, I am adopted. I don't know if you knew that or not, but I am adopted. But then I also I have been divorced and had a broken home with my children, and even blended a family, and it's a challenging exercise to go through. I don't know, maybe exercise is not the right word, but experience to go through. But wouldn't wish it upon anybody. But the reality is, it's the world in which we live, like you said in the beginning, here, that the church has to deal with and has to confront.
Yeah, I know that I hear different statistics from time to time of how many percent of marriages end in divorce these days, but it's higher than we're comfortable with. And
Sure.
I think if the church thinks that we're immune to this type of issue, then we're fooling ourselves. And really, the more that we can prepare for Christian families in these types of situations, and how to prepare not just the congregation for it, but for those families and those parents, I really think is a service. I also come from a broken home growing up,
Mm-hmm.
and I think a lot of people can speak to this anecdotally, and it really gives a certain level, sometimes, of tension to this type of conversation. And so for today, and especially for this class, I really want to balance our personal experiences that are very valuable with all of this, to God's wisdom and what we can see
Absolutely.
in Scripture. A few of the just general questions for you. In your opinion, how common do you think this is in the church? We know it's very common in the world today,
Right.
and it might be a little bit less so, maybe not. Would like to see what you think. But in your opinion, in the different ways that you've seen churches handle this and your experience with them, how well do you think the church handles families in these types of situations?
Well, it is like you said. I mean, we can pull statistics out, and depending on where you pull from and where they sit, it's there, and you really can't hide that. And it does affect the church. I remember having a conversation with somebody and about me and with the broken home, and I said, it's sad to say that there's probably within the next generation going to be a lot more of my type of situations in the church than you would like, and that's kind of happened. We did something when I came back here to work at the Calhoun congregation about a year and a half ago. We were changing our logo and our theme or whatever, and our theme for years had been Christ-centered, family-focused. And then the person that was helping me, who was involved in marketing and everything like this, he said, "Let me ask you about your families. How many of your families are broken or have been broken, dealt with divorce?" And so I just kind of did a quick little search, and I was looking at over 40% of our congregation is either in a broken home situation or a blended family situation. And then when you look at the bigger scale, as far as who's been affected in the families, whether or not it was specifically them or somebody close to them, that number was jumping up closer to 75, 80%. So the sad reality is, I think it is very common in our churches. And it's like you said at the beginning, I don't know that we knew in the early days how to deal with it, and how to treat it. I guess the divorce word, the D word, was almost treated like a death sentence in some situations with people and everything. And I think we're doing better. I do think that we are stepping out. I think that it was uncomfortable to deal with. It is uncomfortable to deal with. Even though we may have improved in a lot of ways, it is uncomfortable. And I think we are doing better at acknowledging it and taking steps forward to try to prevent it, but also say, okay, if this is a situation, how do we move forward, and how do we involve these people who have broken homes and blended families into our churches? But
Yeah.
I still think it is a growing process.
Oh, yeah. And I think one pretty important distinction to make as we're getting into all of this is the difference between all of these situations, that a broken home
Correct.
is very different than a blended family.
Very
And I
much.
think part of the stigma comes from the sin that people assume is involved with
Right.
all sorts of these situations. And while there are absolutely tons of scenarios where sin is involved in a divorce or a separation. There are certain scenarios where it's only on one side and not on another. There are broken homes due to death or passing and different
Mm-hmm.
scenarios like that.
Absolutely.
Adoption constitutes as a blended family, and there's no sin involved with adoption. And
Right.
so a lot of these might have a stigma to it, but a lot of it we can really try and strip away as much of that as we can to get
Right.
to how do we minister to this unique family situation with where they're at. But don't know if you had any
Yeah.
thoughts about that.
No, I think that we push family so much in our churches, and we preach it. I preach it. You preach it about the makeup of the family and everything else like this. That I think when we are faced with this, it's almost, I think, from a church leadership side and teacher side, we probably ask ourselves, where did we mess up, or where did we miss? Where did this? And the sad part is probably we didn't. It's just that's the reality. We live in a fallen world. We live in a broken world, and sometimes, like you said, I appreciate how you just said broken families doesn't have to be necessarily divorce. It can be death. Blended families doesn't have to be two families from divorce coming together. It can be adoption that's in there. And so it encompasses a wide ranging scenarios with the topic we're discussing here.
Right. And without getting too far ahead of ourselves, I remember being so surprised in a graduate class I was taking about family ministry, because I
Mhm.
assumed there was going to be such a heavy focus on the nuclear family, because that's how I conducted my ministry at the time.
Right. Yes. Yep.
And it wasn't necessarily opposing the nuclear family, but the whole point of the graduate class, the professor was saying that the spiritual family is built to sustain. And whether it is from just awful and unfortunate circumstances that lead to a broken or blended household, or more pleasant situations that can lead to a blended family, the church still has the responsibility to be spiritual family, in many different ways. But that transitions into, I want to focus on broken homes first and then transition into blended families. Either as a church or as a Christian, how do you support a family going through a divorce if you see one in real time in your congregation?
Well, I definitely think that empathy is the place to start. And but even with empathy, let me caution with this is unless you've gone through it, and even if you have gone through it, because each situation is different, that we're careful that we don't just run up and say, "Oh, I know what you're going through," and everything else like this, and it's easy in a church, even in a church setting, to take sides,
Mhm.
and especially when there's a divorce and you're talking about, let us say it is a divorce for within the congregation, that's a family that's been there, that's been blended, it's or not blended, but it's a nuclear family like you described, and they've been at the congregation for years. It affects everybody, and one of the things that is tough is our human nature wants to pick a side, especially like you said, when there's sin involved, that we want to quickly jump to the other side and or even possibly put someone down. And I think we've got to remember as Christians, like you said, I love how you described it there, that we are a family. When Paul describes that we all weep together or we all rejoice together, it really does, and it really does affect us. So I would immediately, off of my top of my head, the first thing I would jump out and say is having empathy
Mhm.
for both people that are involved. And sometimes when it is sin involved, it does make us want to harden maybe a little bit. But I think we got to remember that Jesus was grace and truth at the same time. And we're also need to look at that other person who may have sinned, that is still a soul and that is still a child of God that needs reaching out to.
Right. And our conversation is more focused on the parenting and the family aspect of it more than it
Mm-hmm.
is the theology behind it. But
Sure.
I
Oh,
think
yes.
a distinction that can be helpful to most Christians, um, is that our job isn't necessarily to play detective in these types of
Correct.
moments, and that we're allowed to have this empathy while also not envying the position that an eldership would be in, who has
Right.
more responsibility of understanding what is happening in that situation.
Well,
Um,
here's a situation that just happened this morning. It is interesting coming up with this conversation. I was talking to a fellow friend of mine who has gone through a divorce, and they felt like that the church has kind of turned against them because of being divorced. And I reached out to him and just saying, "Hey, thinking about you, of course, praying for you and all those things like this." But he told me, he said, "I appreciate you, reaching out, because I felt like I've lost a lot of people because I'm going through a divorce." And that really broke my heart of just like, no matter what, we're still supposed to be the family of God, like you
right.
said.
So maybe an easier question then to address is, how do you
Mhm.
support a single parent family, whether that is a product of divorce or
Mhm.
adoption or whatever scenario leads up to
Sure.
it? How can we be a Christian family around that? What particular needs do they have?
I think our biggest thing that we need to do, and I do think the church is doing better at this, is opening up our eyes. When you read the early church of how they had everything in common and they looked out for each other and everything else, those single parents, whether it is adoption, whether it is through because of a divorce, there are going to be times when they're going to struggle. Take for instance, if you have a mom or a dad that's a single parent now who always had the other person to help, and as they're doing church, and now they have the kids there, and they're struggling here to get kids to class on time, and trying to get things, or they're sitting in the congregation, and one of them they're having to do. That's where we can be the family and help pick up. You've been involved in youth ministry now for years, and one of the things that I always try to push when I was in my early days of youth ministry even is that, no, this is a family ministry. This isn't just drop your kids off to the youth minister and help them. The church, we are there for each other. That's what it's supposed to be. We're kind of to pick up and to help when one person struggles, that we all come together, and especially if they have young children. There was a young lady that who had a young child back at a congregation I was at in Montgomery, that she struggled every Sunday because she had young kids, and there were times she needed to take one out, and luckily there were some other ladies that were friends of ours that would come up and sit, and so she could deal with that. And so just kind of sitting there and offering a hand, understanding that things like holidays are tough, with dealing with things like this, and so offering a hand and just being there.
Yeah. Well, then maybe an easier transition, maybe more different, you tell me, is focusing on the blended family aspect of it specifically. Right. I think it's easy as a church sometimes to ignore blended families,
Sure.
because it feels more normal from an external standpoint. So in your mind, and maybe even in your experience, what special considerations should we have towards them?
Oh, yeah. Blended families, we will automatically think of them, okay, well, they got their stuff together, and there's still times. Let's give an instance, especially let's say they come from a divorce situation, and you have two families that are blended together. Well, guess what? Those children still have visitations with other parents, and that's a struggle. That is a struggle of coming and maybe perhaps sitting there alone, with the visitations, and with help, needing help to come there. And a lot of the classes that we have are built on for families. You've probably taught classes. I've taught classes about the nuclear family, and sometimes it is tough. Now, here's the deal that we have to struggle with in the church. It's one of our challenges, even as ministers and teachers, is we can't shy away from the truth, but we also have to understand that some of the things that we're going to say to people in there, it may hurt. I'll take, for instance, for me, sitting in a class and they're talking about, well, here's what it's supposed to be. A man and woman get married and they have their 2.5 kids and all this other stuff like this. And I'm sitting here with a blended family. Guess what? It does hurt. And so I think that goes back to that empathy and understanding of all of these things, that yes, there's some helps because they are blended that they can use and count on the other spouse, but there's still some special challenges that go into all this.
So I'm hearing you say in a lot of these that it goes back to mindfulness, of just being aware of the people in your church and really treating them like family, trying to meet them where they're at, and that thoughtfulness really going a long way. But less from the external standpoint. We'll move into more of an internal. What if this is happening to you or your family? If you are a parent in a situation like this, what should you keep in mind?
Well, I think from experience, and I'll just tell you from experience, there's a couple of things that I think you got to be extremely careful with. Number one is what we said a second ago. It's very easy to put the other parent down, wherever the blend comes from. It's very easy to talk about that person, and I think it is because there's a lot of anger sometimes and a lot of hurt sometimes, that child still loves the other parent, whether or not, we're not talking about right or wrong here. Okay. So we're just talking about that child that is still that child's parent. And so we need to remember that, of not putting down the other parent to that child. Second thing I would say is, if you are a parent and you have a blended family together, that means either both sides have kids from a previous marriage, and you're blending those together, or one had a child and the other one didn't, and you come together and you have a child, then be careful not to treat your children different than the others. And what I mean by that, it is very easy to have what I call the Cinderella syndrome, where the old story, the Cinderella and dad marries the woman. She has her three daughters and treats her three daughters better than Cinderella, and Cinderella truly is a stepchild, and that can be very harmful. I'm dealing with that with some people that I know personally right now, that it causes a lot of harm on that child that is treated in that such. And sometimes it's not by any fault, and it's just, we're used to what we're used to, but definitely keep that in mind when you're blending that family.
Yeah, and I think that's it's a good segue into the rest of the questions that we have, being more focused on the children specifically. But that's a really good note, and especially the idea that it's just easier to act normal or act how you would comfortably around someone else's children, because at first they might feel like someone else's children, and it's going to be awkward and difficult to take in new children and treat them just like your own. And it definitely will be uncomfortable, I would imagine, for those first few phases. But the more intentional and deliberate you can be about it, I'm hearing you say, the more effective that is for the relationship.
Right. Even being adopted, as I was adopted, one thing that my parents and I always appreciated is they always told me that I was adopted. It didn't mean that I was any less theirs, but they were very upfront with it. And so maybe it's an adopted that has brought a blended family together. Adoption has, especially if they're older children, is making them feel apart. And even on that side, like you said, being mindful.
Yeah. And so that's a perfect segue into this question that, regardless of the situation, whether it's positive or negative, or there's sin involved or there's not, a complicated family structure, anything besides the nuclear family, almost always manifests into certain things. You can call them issues, you can call them just behaviors, just consequences of a complicated family later on in their life. How do we support these children when they're still children, either as a parent or as a church member?
It is, especially when there's a broken home, or if there is even a death with that broken home, or an adoption. It is really tough on children. It is tough. You yourself said you came from a broken home, and understand it is tough on the children. Number one, blaming themselves from it's my fault, and we'll talk a little bit about this probably in a future question here in a second. To an abandonment feeling. Was I not good enough? What was wrong with me? Even as a child of adoption, and I'm over 40. I'll keep that age to myself. But even as a child of adoption, there are still struggles like that. And my parents were great, loved me, and gave me everything I could have supported. But there is a piece of that comes through. And so in those environments, I think, and I think in our culture, we are doing better than the old typical, whoa, you're just got to pick yourself up by the bootstrap and let's keep going. I think we're doing better than that now. And we are having, we have, especially within our school systems, especially if you're in a private school, and even public schools having resources there available. But even in the church, of even maybe it's somebody who's a mentor for a child, or just asking them and looking out for them, and kind of recognizing some of these signs when you're starting to see some withdrawal, or you're starting to see some moments of depression maybe even set in, to open up our eyes and reach out to them.
Yeah, I think it's very difficult. One thing I wanted to ask about, in addition to this, kind of in conjunction, is there a line where it's unhealthy support? I know children in general are vulnerable and aren't always in control of their emotions, and definitely when you add these complications into their lives, it can really compound that. In terms of just boundaries or projection that they might have onto a caring adult, how do you balance this type of empathy and support and care that you want to show as a Christian family with, the need for that type of safety for them and for
Right. Oh, you bring up a legit and serious topic with when we're talking about all this, because there are boundaries that can be crossed. And what do we do, even if it's not something that we're trying to cross a boundary, whether it's a man or a woman, especially if a child of an opposite sex, or being so nice that you're almost replacing the parent that's dealing with the situation.
Right.
Even, I mean, and everything is coming from, and what I'm talking about is coming from a pure heart, pure thing. And I think that comes back to the mindfulness that we talked about, is that you can cross a line. The children, and especially if they see you as let us say it's a young lady whose dad has left, and then there's another guy there that's showing interest to her because he cares. Well, that's the night you got the knight in shining armor kind of syndrome that can pop in there. And not that the man is doing anything, but there can be some unhealthiness that is attached to it, that especially in our day and time of everything that can be read the wrong way, or taken the wrong way. And I think for people who are reaching out to children, we have to be extremely careful and extremely mindful that we don't allow certain things to cross the line, even if it's, like I said, where you want to be there and you want to support, but kind of like a youth minister is to a family. A youth minister is not the dad or the mom. You're there to help. You're there as an aid from the church to help raise young people in the way of the Lord, not to take the pace of the parent. And I think that's the same mindset you got to have when you're trying to be a mentor, be a help to these young kids.
And that was an idea that I had that I wanted to see what your thoughts were. If you're seeing this, or if you're an uncle or a friend or just part of the church family, one of the ways I see a line of protection in that relationship that you're building with the child is by teaming up with the parent and being very
Right.
vocal and communicative with whichever parents you have access to, communication to, and that sense of teamwork. I know from a youth ministry standpoint is exactly what we shoot for, but
Correct.
even just as members of a church to one another, I think that communication might be able to go a long way.
Absolutely. I think number one, you put some protections in yourself. You don't need to catch yourself in a bad situation. But number two, that communication, like you said, with the parents, even with the elders or with a minister, and saying, here's the situation. So it is a team effort, and sometimes in situations like this, to and parents, I think parents appreciate that. You know that as a youth minister, they appreciate that communication back and forth of saying, here's what the situation is, and hopefully the parents have open hearts and open minds to what you're talking about. But that you have to involve the parent or parents to help this. And if not, you can really set up a wall that pits the children versus the parents, and then pits the parents versus the person trying to help. And that's not healthy. That's not healthy at all.
Especially if the parents have any kind of residual hurt feelings that they're putting onto the church because of a difficult situation or anything.
Oh, absolutely.
That compounding factor can be really difficult. But for time's sake, we'll kind of wrap up our thoughts with these last two questions.
Okay.
Really just in a personal, but also a general sense. What's the real takeaway? What do you consider if this is happening to your family? If you have children as a single parent or children via adoption or marriage, how do you manage, beyond what we've discussed already? I know we've already touched on this a good bit.
Yeah. Do not be afraid of counseling.
That's our last question. Is what are good resources for parents in these situations? So
there you go.
So yeah, you bring up counseling. What do you mean by that specifically? Through a friend, a professional counselor?
I will say this, especially from a church side, and it's okay to get church people involved, but understand this, and I firmly believe this. This is how I view and how I handle things in ministry. I will talk to somebody usually twice, 3 times is maybe the most, and I'm giving biblical advice. But if it's going beyond that, they need to see a licensed professional counselor, because that is what they're trained for. Unless your minister has a counseling background and I would encourage a minister to not do it unless they have that license personally. Don't be afraid. Counseling is not a bad word, and it's not a bad thing. These are people who are licensed, trained. And guess what? It may not be the first counselor you find. You may have to work a little bit to find somebody that works good for you, that works good for your children, that is a safe place for your child to be able to say some things, for you to be able to say some things, and to be able to work with it. Because your kids they're going to be kids, that I said a second ago, they're going to say, it's my fault. You're going to have some, because of it, they're going to have some major anger that's built up, or abandonment feelings that are built up. And if they're not dealt with, the sad part is there will probably be a rebellion, a streak in there. And sometimes, especially if it's dealing with a broken home, as far as a divorce or separation, begin to pit one parent versus the other parent. And so you kind of have this struggle here. And quite frankly, I'm not meaning this in an ugly way, it's hard for you to do by yourself.
Yeah.
And I would read as much as I could, but definitely my number one thing that I tell people is find a good licensed counselor. And definitely one, it's hard sometimes to find one from, say, the members of the church, if they're not, especially depending on what area you're in, but definitely somebody that has a Christian background, that has Christian values and morals behind it, to be able to say, look, I'm not here trying to throw God out. We're trying to put everything in. But counseling would be my number one resource I would recommend to parents.
Okay. Well, that's about all that we have time for. But Jon, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you have any closing thoughts for us, or anything you'd like for us to know that maybe wasn't covered?
Hey, like I said, we live in a fallen world, but by the grace of God, we are still here. It's not the end. If you have a broken home from a divorce or a death or a separation, if you're a blended family because of adoption, it's not the end of the road. It's not the end of if I can say it, it's not a stigma that kicks you out or anything else like this. But by the grace of God, we keep moving forward, and you got a wonderful church family. And Landon, I just appreciate y'all talking about this topic and not being afraid to face it straight on.
Well, thanks so much for your time. We hope to have you back in Columbus sometime soon.
Absolutely.
Thanks again.